Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it.
Red, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. This is Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, bringing you another episode of The Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the Grand Solar Minimum. Thank you for joining us. We have a special guest tonight, Lee Wheelbarger, who is a military electronics specialist, an inventor, and he has many other interesting facets to this guy. He's working on the Solar Yacht Project, the Electric Blue Solar Yacht Project, America's Solar Boat Cup, and has many other things up his sleeve probably to discuss with us. But it's April, and we've been discussing the chemtrail conspiracy theory, how that relates to the Grand Solar Minimum, and all the disinformation that's out there for you to get confused by. Also joining us is the CEO of the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, Leah, to bring a feminine point of view to all the nonsense. Lee, can you hear me, and are you there?
Yes, sir.
Awesome.
Good evening, both of you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Can you give our audience a little bio of your background and what you're currently doing?
Well, I originally started out designing electronics at a young age. I guess my first claim to fame was I invented the helmet cam for the U.S. Army Telemedical Command, which was the world's first full duplex video audio data transceiver system that could send a video image from any point on the surface of the Earth to any other point on the surface of the Earth in a 15.5-pound package. And what that did is it allowed a paramedic on the battlefield to send a video image from a wounded combat soldier up through a satellite down to a major medical facility like Walter Reed or Bethesda Medical to help save that combat soldier's life on the battlefield.
Awesome.
So after I invented that, I went to the Army, became senior technologist for the Dismounted Battlespace Battle Lab at Fort Benning, and then my career has just exploded since then, and that was 30 years ago.
Awesome. Now, you have also special interest in the science that I've been following and my background in paleoclimatology. I've been a teacher
Absolutely.
Back in late 80s. So go ahead. What were you saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I also go back and study paleoclimatology, doing through carbon-14 and beryllium-10 and sunspot data and so on and so forth, as well as cosmic ray data, as well as galactic cosmic ray data, as how those two interact with our atmospheric conditions, which again ties into the chemtrail story.
Yeah, so let's get on with the chemtrail conspiracy theory version of tonight's radio program. Leah and I have been doing some research, and we are specifically into this cloud seeding program that China is proposing. So real quick, I just wanted to go over some of the basics of cloud seeding. I want to get Leah's point of view, and then Lee, you can jump in about the cloud seeding in China and anything you know about the history of cloud seeding that I'm not covering right now. So Just in general, what I was able to uncover is that cloud seeding goes way back up to 75 years ago. Really serious science was involved during World War II, where its history really began. And that's when they were using it to interrupt severe storms, to try to produce rain or snow. And it never really developed into practice. But recently, it's been used at ski resorts and for a host of a whole other bunch of nonsense. If you have enough money, you can pay a company to seed a cloud with silver iodine or a similar substance to supposedly produce more rain or snow. Now, that's the claim, but the interesting thing is if you do your homework and you go really deep into cloud seeding and what it is, and you look at all the papers, despite its being used in 52 countries around the world, both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Meteorological Society doubt that cloud seeding even works. So, Leah, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I mean, the story this week, in fact, it's been hitting the news about China is pretty interesting. I mean, they're talking about bringing up tens of thousands of cloud seeding chambers up onto the Tibetan Plateau. There's probably about 500 of those chambers up there right now. They're talking about spending, they're already apparently spending an incredible amount of money, something like $60 to $90 million a year. I don't know. It's very confusing because you read through the news and you look at the numbers, and it never really quite jives. For one, China claims that between 2006 and 2016 that they're making 55 billion cubic meters of rain every year. But I'm also having trouble finding out what their real goal is because the numbers across the media are all over the place. And perhaps that's an issue of getting the right information out of China. They've already spent $266 million between 1995 and 2003. And then there's some other concerns like, okay, well, what happens with the Indian monsoon winds? If China seeds over the Tibetan Plateau to bring water to the tributaries that feed China and the rest of Asia, does that mean that they're then stealing water that might fall somewhere else from another region? So, there's a bunch of concerns about that. And then, of course, there's also concerns about pollution from from silver iodide. And, what does that do to aquatic life? And like Diamond said, in 2003, the U.S. Academy of Sciences said that after 30 years of study, there was no conclusive evidence that weather modification has efficacy at all, really. On the other hand, the American Meteorological Society says, well, in some studies, in some places, you might get a 10% increase. By the same token, the Iranian Meteorological Organization says that they're able to get a 20% increase in precipitation in some places. And then there's other things like Australia has been trying to do this, and they've basically had no success over the continent of Australia except for Tasmania. And there's a heck of a lot of money being spent overall on this, which I find kind of mind-boggling considering that there's not really conclusive evidence that this even works. So I'm pretty interested to hear what Lee has to say about all of this and whether or not it works, and is it even worth anybody spending any money on this, and are there dangers and concerns?
Yeah, Lee, so $300 million for 4 extra toxic raindrops. What say you?
I say that China is convinced that it works. China actually started their weather modification program in 1980. Currently, they have over 37,000 people in their weather modification program. They have 4,000 rocket launchers, 7,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 30 aircraft. I guess their most famous feat as far as weather modification or weather control would have been in 2008 during the Olympic opening of the Bird's Nest theater that they had there for the opening of the Olympics. They stopped it from raining and cleared the air so as that they could have all those ceremonies without a drop of rain falling anywhere. So they're convinced that it works. It is toxic. There are other ways to do weather modification other than just silver iodide. You can use salt, you can use dry ice, and you can also use hydrochloric acid vapor, which is actually the best. And you can do that from the surface using a turbine engine and injecting the vapor into the exhaust, blowing it straight up. And because of the superheated gases and the vortices of that, and if you've got rising air currents anyway, that'll carry it up. And you can do massive cloud seeding with that. And I've seen different instances of where it appears as though that is what's transpiring currently in weather wars between us and other countries, back and forth regularly. I mean, the weather modification actually started in World War II, like you were saying. The first examples of that were the pilots coming back across the channel. It was really foggy in Britain and they couldn't see the airstrips. So the British went and put pipelines all the way around their runways, and they would, light off the pipelines with gasoline spewing out of them. And the heat would evaporate it off, and it would literally burn off the fog so as that the pilots could come and land on the runways. After that, back in, I guess, from 62 to 83, the Noaa tried to do weather modification of hurricanes, and they spent a lot of money and a lot of research on it. But in 83, the radar was good enough to see that, no, actually, they weren't really having any effect, so they canceled the program. Now, as far as the U.S. military applying it in Vietnam, the U.S. had a military operation called Operation Popeye, and they dropped 47,000 silver iodide containers over Vietnam, and they were each year they were able to extend the monsoon season by 45 days. So they had fairly good success with that over that region. But it's, again, 47,000 containers. That's a lot of flights to do that. So, the Chinese are convinced it will work. I have seen it work. I don't think that a lot of the chemtrails that people see each day are actually chemtrails. I actually think that those are contrails that are being enhanced by cosmic rays streaming out of coronal holes on the sun. So, if you go out one day and every single one of the contrails is really, really fat and you think they're all chemtrails, you've got some cloud nucleation taking place because of highly charged particles coming into our atmosphere through our magnetosphere streaming in from the sun. So where else you want to go?
So real quick, there's a paper coming out, Lee, on the 28th of March of this year. I don't know if you heard about it. It just really hit hard in the last 48 hours. From the Journal of Geography, Environment, and Earth Sciences International. It's talking about deadly ultraviolet UVC and UVB penetrating to the Earth's surface. Now, in the paper, it calls the persistent contrails chemtrails. So right away when I was reading it, I discredited the paper. But there is evidence of UVC hitting the surface. Do you have any comments on that?
Absolutely, I agree completely, and that does it biologically. There's two ways to do it. One is electrically through the cosmic rays and galactic cosmic rays. Cosmic rays are 3 to 5 million teravolts, and a galactic cosmic ray is anywhere from 300 to 500 million tera electron volts. So when they interact with particles in our atmosphere, each one coming in is like a sparkler going off, creating chain reactions coming all the way down to the ground. And some galactic cosmic rays are so powerful they pass all the way through the planet. So, there's just really no shielding from it that anyone outside of a government could afford. So, there's a lot of enhancements. We also have the problem with galactic cosmic rays creating biological changes in gases. We have an increase from of nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, and there are substantial amounts of nitric oxide being created in our upper atmosphere from cosmic rays, and that is causing a cooling at high altitude. That was in a paper that came out, I think, December 7th of last year or the year before, from NASA, Goddard, and I can't remember what the other government agency was that was in on that. So yeah,
so
it does. Go ahead.
The UVC, what's so dangerous about the UVC?
I can't tell you as far as the danger of it, as far as what it does, as far as the individual's UVs. All I've studied on that is the variation in the illumination of those and how they change plant life. And I don't do it as UVC. I do it as in everything in nanometers, which is the frequency of the wavelength of it. So you have the extreme UV, which can actually vary by up to 700%. and that'll cause cataracts and changes in plant life. It'll burn your skin. Already we're seeing with the small changes that we've already had in the sun, if you look nationwide, the number of sunburn cases are out the roof. So it's burning people's skin. You can feel it through even windows with window tint, the change in it, and the sun is varying in its intensity. And with these, so when you look at the TSI, which is the total solar irradiance, that's all of the frequencies that the sun is emitting simultaneously. But individual frequencies within those radio or magnetic frequency ranges, the extreme UV up near the X-rays, all of that varies. And they also just discovered, when you speak of X-rays, that lightning bolts, each individual lightning bolt that comes down and hits the ground also emits X-rays every time there's a bolt. And on average in the United States, in Florida, there's a bolt of lightning that hits every square mile. There's 50 strikes per year per square mile. And in Africa, it's up to 300 strikes per square mile per year. There's 8,000 strikes per minute.
We've been covering the increased electricity in the form of lightning occurring across the globe in the last 6 months. Additionally, we covered a paper coming out from the mainstream in the medical journal of the increased incidences of certain melanomas and skin cancers, definitely associated with this UVB and C and A in the increase. And it's interesting because it's antithetical. As the sun is waning and the TSI is dropping, you wouldn't think that there would be more harmful rays coming in from it, but in fact, the waning magnetosphere of the Earth allows that to occur. So as the sun goes down in power, so do our shields, allowing more of these dangerous rays to come in. And the cosmic ray interactions happening up in the upper stratosphere and the ionosphere, where the ionization is occurring, is causing more radioactive elements to spontaneously nucleate and rain down on our heads. This is all going to be continuing to increase as we move forward. Leah, do you have anything to add?
Not at the moment, I don't.
Leah, do you have anything to say about the ionization and the radioactive cosmic dust that's falling on us?
Well, yeah, that is increasing, and it has been, and more in the northern latitudes than in the southern latitudes. So you're seeing a much higher increase in cloud nucleation, and you're seeing a much higher increase in the amount of particles coming in. In fact, when you look back through history, we're at an all-time high right now, and we've seen anywhere from a 10 to a 13% increase just in 2 years. So it doesn't look good as far as the slowing down of cosmic rays or galactic cosmic rays coming in.
So should we be worried about the radiation from space? I mean, people are worried about Fukushima, which I think is kind of crazy, especially if you live in Arizona or something.
I wouldn't be as worried as some people. I do protect myself by wearing long sleeve clothing. I always wear UV protection as far as glasses, because one of the main things that the extreme UV causes is cataracts. It does deform plants, and as well as creates plants that look like they're mature on the outside because the outer skin of the fruit has ripened because it feels like it has received the correct amount of UV, but actually it's the inside has not ripened. The outside looks ripe, but the inside is still immature. So there's been several different fruits that are in other produce that has been produced that has looked like it's ripe on the outside, but it's actually not. And there's been lots of examples of that all over the world. Dave from Adapt 2030 covers that regularly.
That's very interesting. That's something I'd actually noticed, like in the grocery store. And I'll pick up a pear and I look at the skin and it has a look that it's clearly ripe, but it's hard as a rock. And I know sometimes that can sometimes happen in storage. I know there's some chemicals that are sometimes sprayed to prevent early ripening before it's ready to go to market. But nonetheless, it does seem to be happening a little bit more often, as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
Really, I'd like to get back to some more geoengineering. You had a story about something happening in Florida?
Yes, and I've seen this happen numerous times. So the first time that it ever caught my attention was back during Hurricane Katrina, and people can go back and get the Noaa radar imagery off the internet and see what I'm talking about. But if they'll look when Katrina was at the southwestern corner of Florida before it intensified, if they were to look to the west-southwest several hundred miles, they would notice three little plumes that started on the surface and looked like something was on fire. If you've ever looked at a volcano from visual satellite imagery, you can see that plume coming off.
It looks like a cotton ball.
Well, this was more of the streak that comes out as it's the continuing eruption, or like a large wildfire that's burning.
Yes.
So there's three streaks, and the streaks actually look like the scratch marks on the Monster Energy drink. You know what I'm saying? The three scratch marks. So there were these three scratch marks lines coming up, and Hurricane Katrina was like a strong category 1 or moving into a category 2. And within hours of those streaks being injected into Hurricane Katrina just exploded. So I was like shocked at what I had seen. And I've seen it a few other times. But 2 days ago in the afternoon, I saw a plume on the radar out of Tampa, and the radar plume that it picked up was way farther out to sea than the regular cloud tops that I was seeing. So it was, a much higher altitude because of the curvature of the Earth, or what's called the radio horizon. And so, it had to have been, thousands of feet higher. And so I saw it and I tweeted out, something major just happened. And what I thought it was when I saw it on the radar, because I didn't see it on the visible, I only saw it on the weather radar, I thought that a rig had exploded, and that was the thermal column from the rig explosion coming up. And that's why I said, we'll see if we see it on the news. Then later in the evening, or that night, we got 8 inches of rain across northern Florida from that. And so I went back on the radar, and you can actually see this feeding into the bands. And when it feeds into the bands, it just explodes on the radar, and you get basically what looked like rain bombs coming down. I mean, at one time here at the house, the rain was coming down at 5.44 inches per hour.
So what is this, weather modification from a ship, or is it a rocket?
It looks to me, it looks as though it's coming off of a ship or an oil rig, and it could easily be done on a ship if you were using sulfuric acid. And like I said, you had a turbine engine, and you spun that turbine up, and then you heated it and released the vapor into the exhaust at the end of the exhaust, so that you're not contaminating the ship. It's in the center of the thermal column. It's going to carry it up and away, and the ship's moving away. There won't be a single particle of it on the outside of the ship. You wouldn't even be able to detect it, if you inspected the ship afterwards, unless you actually went into the tank that contained it. And it would be in a very, very easy and effective way to do that. And from what I've been seeing of the at least 8 times that I've seen it on radars and visibles and so on and so forth, and studied the heck out of it each time I saw it, each time I see it, that's what it appears as though. It appears as though there are 3 ships, and it just so happens that I think there were 3 ships in Cuba that went into the Gulf just before Hurricane Katrina, in the same general vicinity as where these plumes were coming from. So it's all, I can't physically tie them together, but I can tie them in the same area at the same time and the same number.
So this is a government exercise that we don't know about, that's weather modification to gather data.
Probably. I would think that it's, again, we are in a tit for tat with Putin right now. Anyway, you got to remember, we're getting ready to send, we have the possibility of sending in excess of 442 Tomahawk missiles that are within range of Syria at the present moment.
Could be happening now.
Could be, yeah, absolutely. And Trump doesn't want to start a war with Putin. Okay. And Trump has to show that I'm not going to let Assad cross that line. And Putin knows that Trump has to do that. That's why Trump told Putin, we're coming. And that's why Putin brought all of his ships out of the harbor today to get them out so he could go in and deal with Assad. So it's going to happen. And the Chinese, all of these countries know this is happening. Russia knows it's happening. China knows it's happening. Pakistan, all of these countries around the world are preparing except for the United States. All of this weather modification that China is doing to be able to put water out to feed their masses because they know other parts of their continent are going to go offline and they're not going to be able to feed their billions of people when those northern latitudes go offline. They already know this. They know that Africa is going to be fertile and going to have lots of rains. That's why they went down there and purchased millions of hectares and put railroad lines across Africa so as that when the climate does shift and they can start growing in those regions, they can come in with those train gangs that are able to produce an entire railroad station in 8 hours and roll the trains out, right off of the ships and just have the train that's going to the farthest end go first and then the next one and the next one and the next one. And within 12 hours, you have all of your rail stations built across the continent. And now they can stop and do whatever they want. The Chinese and the Russians are the number ones on putting it together for the grand solar minimum and know what's going on. That's why Russia went into Ukraine and captured Crimea and came all the way over to Donetsk, and that they're holding the line there at Donetsk. So, that's the breadbasket of Europe, and that will be online for a while. And so Russia wants to have control of that. And all they've got to do is cut straight up from Crimea, straight through Kiev, and come right up and intersect with Russia again in a pincer movement. And they'll take all of that in a matter of days. So, we're not preparing, but, Russia and China are. And that's, again, what this weather modification that China is trying to do. They don't care what it does to the environment. They want to survive as a civilization or an empire because they've fallen every time there's been a grand solar minimum.
Yeah, there is the historical documentation, and the countries in the Far East are well aware of the agricultural data. All we have over here is the Farmer's Almanac, which is the most accurate weather predicting tool that uses the sun for forecasting, and that only dates back a few hundred years. We're talking in China and Japan in those regions, they have agricultural information dating back 4,000 years. Which includes 4 of the grand minimas, the biggest, the grand solar minimas, and all the grand minimas in between. And we're talking dozens of events that have caused their empires to collapse. Our empire here in the Western world hasn't collapsed as many times, and we do not have that lesson book. But I wonder if our government isn't preparing in their own way to save their own asses, and they don't give up about us, Lee.
Well, I think that our government is aware of it. I think that they don't want to make us aware of it. And what leads me to believe that is because of a report that the Department of Homeland Security did that basically said that there are so many private companies in the United States that have private employees of those small companies, and those owners of those small companies are well enough off that if something like this were announced, they could close their businesses. And by closing their businesses and going somewhere else or heading for the hills, that the number of people that would put out of business would cripple the economy of the United States. So will our government tell us that it's going to hit the fan? Probably. But when will they tell us? Right before it happens. So,
or 4 days after.
Right. You're about to get hit by that tsunami that hit you yesterday. So, that's the problem that we have in our government. There are so many people in our economy it's the economy stupid. And I look at it as it's survival, you idiot. So, it's all in how you look at it. So, way I look at it is to get the information and get the truth out there so that people can go and see for themselves and then try to come up with ways that they can deal with it themselves. And they're prepared for it and they know what's coming. If you don't know what's coming, that's what kills you. And it's always what you don't know is what kills you. So if you know about what's going on and you can prepare for that, then you are much better suited to deal with it and know what's coming and how to deal with that in the future. So EMPs, CMEs, increased snow, colder temperatures, more crazy weather, upset jet stream, cloudier skies, ocean temperatures falling, warm water in the ocean not penetrating as deep. In fact, this last El Nino, it only penetrated 30% as deep as it normally does. And as you can see it right now, the PDO and everything else is just falling on its face. And this is the thing. When I started talking about this years ago, people laughed in my face and called me a fool. And now I'm getting phone calls from people all over the world, World Bank and everybody else wanting to know what I would do if I were them. So, it's come around full circle from being called a fool to now being called an authority. And, I got asked the other day if I would prepare a brief for some senior government officials. So I'm actually working on that now. So they do know, because I know somebody that already briefed them. They want my perspective on it. So I'm in the process of writing that. That was one of the reasons I called David the other day. And I wanted to talk to you about that. But, they want to do things. I think Trump has this on a back burner and doesn't talk about it. But in the trade war with China and other things that he's doing and trying to build up America and build up our infrastructure, I think he knows what's going on and he's doing it in his own way without talking about it. And so, that's the great part about Trump being president, now is that we've got somebody that actually would give a damn and do something about it, or at least it looks like it is.
That perspective of the sort of political defensiveness that you just described, it definitely sheds a lot of light, because one of the questions I've been asking myself, I have been of the opinion for quite some time that our government absolutely knows that grand solar minimum is coming, and it's given away, in my opinion, by simply the ridiculous narrative about global warming that's in the media. Especially these days, and some of the blatant lies that are happening about, there's a heat wave in the Arctic and all of this ridiculous stuff. So it then begs the question, why work on weather modification to create more rain when we're going to be getting more rain anyway? And it would seem sort of troubling. But when I look at it from the perspective that you just offered, obviously it's not going to be raining everywhere, and everybody wants to ensure that they have the rain that they're going to need. And the rest of it doesn't matter. The pollution doesn't matter, none of it. As long as we can, control our own little territory here.
Right. The people talk about the Mongoloids, and the Mongoloids were so vicious and ruthless. Well, why? They were starving to death. And
that'll do that to people.
Right. And when you and your family are starving to death, you'll do anything. And so when the last time we had, one of these major events and the Mongoloids came down, they were starving. And so they invaded because they knew they were going to starve to death or freeze to death, or, combination thereof, if they didn't do something. So that's why the Mongoloids have such a ruthless reputation, is because of what they actually did, because of what we're going into. When you don't have any food and you have no way to grow any food and all of your animals are dead and your children are dying, you will stop at nothing to feed yourself and them. And so that drives people, and, it's going to drive people, because there is going to be a lot of agricultural lands that go offline in the next few years. And, years ago when I was calling for it to start right now as it is, okay, that it would be visible right now in this winter, and it has been all winter. This is going to continue to progressively push our springs farther back. So what we'll do is we'll go from winter into basically summer. And then they'll finally get the plants in the ground, and then we'll get these freak hailstorms that will come along, and everything that is produced that is above ground will be destroyed. And then if they do get a crop that's in the ground and the crop is not destroyed by the hail or the bad weather, so on and so forth, then they will get an early freeze or an early frost or an early snow and kill it off then or flood it out.
Yeah, that's how it goes. And it's you were talking about the Mongoloids, the Vikings, the sea people came and they conquered Europe because they were starving too, because they had no more food up there in Newfoundland.
Absolutely.
I think it's very likely it's the same reason that the Normans traveled and conquered England and, moved on and whatever. I mean, there's, it seems that at every, grand solar minimum, certainly, we know that empires collapse, and as well, there's always a migrating population that looks for something else to conquer because, like you said, when people are starving, they're desperate. So it certainly helps explain the extreme amount of money that a lot of countries are putting into weather modification.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, this time around, I think maybe they'll seal the borders because they do have some information, and they will not want the migration to occur. Because once migration occurs, then you're going to have wars sparking up, small wars along all these borders. Lee, what's your point?
Well, I agree with you that all of these countries are going to want to fight for whatever it takes. They are going to want to lock their borders down, arm their citizens, protect their assets, and have the best leverage in trade or ability to get the goods that they need into their lands. And, it's the northern countries and the southern countries that are closest to the Arctic regions that are going to be most affected by this. The agricultural heartlands that we have in different countries in Europe and Asia and in the United States, most of those are going to go offline. So it's going to be mainly tropical production in the future. You won't be able to produce in Iowa and other northern latitudes like that. You're even going to have problems in Illinois and Kansas.
We may even be having problems this year with that, as
Absolutely.
It turns out.
And
it's looking that way for sure. There's so much snow on the ground in the Midwest. And it's planting time, so we're in trouble.
Yeah, we just checked the soil temperatures in Iowa. They're not above 32. They should be above 44 this time of year. That's the average. So they're running 14 degrees or more below normal at 4 inches down, all the way down into central Illinois.
Yeah, and I've had farmers see. Last year is when the farmers started really noticing this and calling me, and I was getting phone calls almost every day, about, what should I plant? And it goes back, and I always tell everybody, look at what survived back in the day, what people lived off of, like potatoes. So there's a blue potato that works very well, grows very well in cold climates, and it is resistant to UV. And it's an Adirondack potato. And so we've already started growing those in our garden here. And the reason that I suggest growing things like potatoes is because when you have the hail, you have the rains and the freak weather, the high winds and the torrential downpours, potatoes seem to handle that much better than anything else. And a prime example of that was during the last little ice age. The Scottish told the French that you need to plant potatoes. But the French were like, no, we want our wheat for our Christmas. So they grew their wheat, and 2 million of them starved to death that year because the storms and the hail came through and destroyed their entire wheat crop, and there was nothing left to eat. And so I think 12 million people starved to death during that period, combined amongst all of the different countries because of famine. They couldn't feed their animals. They couldn't feed anything. It was cold and gloomy, and the soil temperatures weren't high enough, and there was insufficient light of the UV and the red spectrum to get a yield or for the plants to mature. So there was nothing to eat, and they died. And, that's where the potato famine comes from. And this has been repeated over and over and over and over in history, going back thousands and thousands of years. So it's not something that we have never seen before. There are 4 electromagnetic fields in the sun, and those 4 electromagnetic fields are currently going 180 degrees out of phase. when they do that, they cancel out each other's magnetic fields, just like a Bose headset cancels out sound. And as it cancels out those magnetic fields, the sun will be incapable of producing sunspots. And the sunspots kind of act like little extra flares on the sun, and they push the galactic cosmic rays away, and they put out a little bit more heat for us. And the sun itself puts out less cosmic rays, and so we have clearer skies, more sunshine comes in, the oceans become warmer, and we've had the period of 176 years of warming like we've been experiencing. However, there's a downside of that. It goes in a 206-year cycle, and so every 206 years, two fields go out of phase, and then every 412 years, all four fields go out of phase. So this time, we're going with all four fields out of phase, and that will make basically the face of the sun become very, very quiet with no sunspots for a long time, and will allow more cosmic rays to come in, more galactic cosmic rays. If the sun weakens, our electromagnetic field weakens. As the electromagnetic field weakens and the sun's solar wind stream weakens, our magnetic field becomes bigger, and guess what? It captures even more galactic cosmic rays because the area that it encompasses in space is larger, so it's a bigger net, catches more cosmic rays. They come down into our planet, we get more cloud nucleation, increased clouds create increased albedo effect. Bright sunny clouds are 35% more refractive, or refract 35% of the light that hits them. So you have more cloud cover. That means less light is going into the ocean to heat the oceans, and more snow cover is coming on the planet. That snow cover keeps the ground cold, and again, snow reflects light a whole lot better than the ground itself does, so even less is absorbed and more goes back into space, and it's a snowball effect. And the glaciers start to grow, and the snow starts to grow. And the glaciers back in the days of the last little ice age, they would move at feet per hour and move down through and just wipe villages away as they moved through, because the snow kept coming in the mountains and just kept pushing down through the valleys and pushing everything away. And the priest went and prayed for it to stop, but sun said it wasn't going to happen. So you've got 30 years of cooling and 176 years of warming. And like I said, we just finished 176 years of warming. That can be seen by this past solar cycle 24. The second peak of it was higher than the first peak. And when you go back through all of the solar cycles in history that we can look at, both through beryllium-10 and carbon-14 dating, so actually going back thousands of years, normally when you see that second peak being higher than the first peak on any solar cycle, the sun goes into a substantial decline after that. That was discovered by Jack Eddy and was validated and re-researched by John Casey, formerly from NASA, and was the science advisor for two different presidents. So their work, along with the electric universe theory and plasma physics, is what I follow, along with the Cloud Project, Heinrich.
Leah, do you have anything?
That of Valentina Zarkova, and I derive a lot of my calculations from that.
I actually
Leah.
have a question, which is just about this is actually getting back into not so much weather modification, but more a question about chemtrails. Now, a lot of people ask us questions about, well, why am I finding lots more aluminum in the soil as whereas barium and strontium? And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the simple answer here is simply that, cosmic rays bringing in additional ions into the atmosphere, which eventually cascades as rain. Would that be correct in your opinion?
That would be part of it. And then you also have, everything that we are putting off. So if we're grinding particles, if there's a facility that's machining materials and creating dust and other aerosols and particles, welding, the government spraying, There are a variety of other things that can put that into the soil as well, in addition to, like you're saying, what the sun puts off, and that can be varying because the sun is varying. So the normal levels of what we normally see are not normal anymore. Some of those are varying, and you can see that in the different spectrums when you look at the sun through the SDO, the Solar Dynamic Observatory. So.
Now, if we look at the CMIP6, the new solar forcing model, it doesn't show a recovery in 30 years. It shows the total solar irradiance waning all the way towards 2150.
I'll agree with that.
Yeah. Now, and additionally, the modern eddy minimum is unlike any other grand solar minimum for the last 4 millennia. I would even say 10 millennia, because we haven't had a magnetic excursion since around 12,000 years ago. And we are headed into a magnetic excursion, or a magnetic reversal, or a magnetic pole flip, or a magnetic pole shift, however you want to put it. It is not the rotational pole of the Earth flipping for people listening out there. It's the magnetic field. Now, that might not seem as bad, and in fact, NASA is trying to kind of underplay the dangers of this pole flip, but we don't have good data on what happened 12,000 years ago, except for the paleontological record, which shows a mass extinction when this event occurred. Also, many other magnetic excursions for the last 150,000 years coincide with mass extinction events. Also, huge deposits of carbon up to an inch thick, or coal measures, where there is mass extinctions happening below the coal measure, and in that carbon layer there is increased radioactive materials, including microspherules, nanodiamonds, microdiamonds, and other things that can only be explained using cosmogenic forces. Can you touch on that, Lee?
Yeah, and the first thing I want to stipulate there is I don't consider what is happening now an excursion. I would consider this more of a pole flip. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is an excursion is it'll change a little bit and move a little bit and stop. And that can happen regularly while the poles are flipping, which the entire thing could be considered an excursion. But and the way they do that is through lava flows, and they've seen that in a matter of days that the magnetic field in that region can flip back and forth. And the reason that is because the magnetic field is actually a molten material, kind of like a lava lamp inside the Earth. And so as we've got more energies coming into the Earth, because our field is weaker and the sun is weaker, that is actually heating up the lava inside the Earth and allowing it to move because it's a little thinner, and allowing it to move more. At the same time, the crust of the Earth is cooling because we're going through that cooling phase. So you've got the magnetic reversal part of it, then which the lava again is warming, which means it is slightly expanding. And then you have the crust on the outside that's cooling, which means that it's kind of contracting. And when those two come together, you have volcanic events, you have earthquakes, and then you have the fissures that you see that keep opening up all over the United States and the world here in the last few years. And those fissures are part of this cooling that's been going on the planet, and the planet's trying to adjust to the increased pressures inside as well as the decreased size of the landmass because it's all cooling. And we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see way more volcanoes and way more seismic events as we continue down on our downward trend. And the crazy part about the magnetic pole reversal that we've got going on now is people think that the magnetic poles in the Earth are like a bar magnet that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole, and you just flip it around. It's not like that at all. It's like the lava lamp I was referring to. And so one glob is the northern part is coming down across Russia, and the South Pole is coming up, and those two are going to crisscross each other somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And the acceleration of those has been pretty much exponential here over about the last 10 to 15 years. It used to be that it only moved a few miles in a couple hundred years, and now we're, I think, in excess of 5 miles a year or something. It's really starting to truck it.
Yes, indeed. Leah, do you have any thing to touch on there?
I do not, just except that certainly the speed at which the magnetic placement has been changing would certainly scream that this is about a pole flip and not an excursion.
Yeah, the acceleration is shocking, and it is exponential, as you said, Lee. And the difficult thing is that the magnetic pole is following, so it may be stationary for an instant when you're measuring it, but it actually rotates around with the Earth, and it takes a full year to actually find the position of that circle and from the start point to the end point to figure out if it's migrated. So it takes a very long time, years, to figure out where this baby's moving. So we don't get an actual data point. They only make a data point every 5 years. So we're still waiting on the next data point to see if that exponential increase is still happening.
Well, there are some people that are actually tracking the pole by the day, trying to do it electronically. And the other thing I wanted to point out was the South Pole was moving slower than the North Pole. So they're both not moving at the same speed either. But there's actually used to be a boat that you could get on, and you could actually float over the North Pole. You could get on a boat from Russia and go out and meet the North Pole because it's not over ice or land anymore.
It's interesting, too, that there's been a lot of notes sort of made about animals that rely on magnetics for navigation seeming to get lost or perhaps migrating at the wrong time of year, and one has to wonder if that has something to do with magnetic pole reversal. What do you think about that, Lee?
I agree with that 100%. And the reason that I agree with that is because the sheer number of people who have called me, and actually the number of birds that I have seen that are homing pigeons that are just lost. Mm-hmm. And they can't see it. And there was a new paper that just came out the other day that said that it's not through their beak or something in their brain. They actually see the magnetic field lines through their eyes. Mm-hmm. So if you could imagine flying in a 3D topo map, and somebody takes the software and pushes down one mountain and goes over and pushes down another mountain on the topo map, well, then nothing looks the same anymore. How do you fly home? And that's what the birds are experiencing. I had one of my friends who had a homing pigeon. We actually got the number off of it and tracked it. The bird was from Chile and was stuck in Virginia and stayed there for 2 weeks. These birds don't just go, you know what, I haven't been to the United States, I'm going to go on vacation in Virginia. It doesn't
Virginia
happen.
Is for lovers.
Right. I love the place. I'm staying, find me a dove. So, it doesn't work that way. And, you've got the beachings, you've got the turtles, you've got the birds, migrations, you've got other animals that aren't showing up, or they're showing up in the wrong places. And it's because when you look at how the magnetic field on the planet is, and you see what they see by looking at those magnetic field lines, and then it wiggles a little bit, it doesn't take much wiggling until it doesn't look recognizable anymore. And then they're just lost. Because if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you are, and it isn't like the bird's going to have OnStar. So he's stuck, and it's a shame because these poor animals can't find their way anymore, and the effect is in the regions that are seeing the magnetic anomalies. And so there are greater, anomalies in some regions than in others, and that's what you're seeing. And you can look at, there's a wide variety of satellites that have been sent up that are seeing things, as far as our magnetic field, and we can see it changing. And then there's sensors on the ground that see it as well. So it's underway, and I do believe it will be a flip. And I think that it will continue to accelerate dramatically over the next 12 years, at least.
So that being said, if the projections are correct, we will reach the 0 point, meaning the point at which the North Pole and the South Pole meet somewhere around the equator. This is going to occur west of Indonesia if they stay on the current path, sometime in 2035. Now, Lee, do you follow and have you read the work of Robert Felix?
Yes, I have. I really like Robert Felix, and I like a lot of his work. I don't agree with everything that he puts out, but then again, there's a lot of people I don't agree with everything that they put out. But, so yeah, I have seen his work.
So the one thing he touches on is that as the magnetosphere wanes towards zero, the magnetic shield on the Earth is actually falling towards the surface of the Earth and allowing that interface of the magnetopause, where the cosmic, let's say a CMA came off the sun, that the magnetopause is where the impact occurs. And NASA and others recently have seen nuclear explosions occurring at the magnetopause when these CMEs hit the magnetopause. And Robert Felix purports that as the magnetic field weakens towards zero, the magnetopause comes into the upper atmosphere of the Earth. And these nuclear explosions occur in our atmosphere, raining down cosmogenic debris. And when he described that, it kind of clicked with me, and it made complete sense that this is what's causing the mutagenic effects, causing spontaneous evolution as well as extinction.
Well, I haven't seen that. And I wouldn't call it a nuclear explosion. I would call it a plasma discharge or a plasma reaction. And prior to studying plasma physics.
Hold your thought, because this is good stuff, Lee, and we're at the break. I'm sorry. So 5 minutes, and let's get right back into the plasma discharge at the magnetopause. I hope you guys are following. This is crazy, and it's the inconvenient truth.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Join me weekdays for my new show, Tell Chris Joe. It's going to be a problem show brought to you live from Kensington. Thursdays, I'm dealing with hot topics, heated debate, what's new around the world, and ring-ins to discuss listeners' problems and offering considered and heartfelt solutions. So join me, Chris Hart, for Tell Chris Joe. Stop what you're doing, grab a cup of tea, and coming live from Kensington. Relax. Let me entertain you with a coffee bar online. Listeners' very personal problems. So that's Thursdays, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. See you there. It's going to be lots of fun.
This is Barbara DeLong, host of Nightlight Radio, inviting you to join me on a cosmic journey, exploring a metaphysical montage of spiritual material, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between, including spiritual readings for those who seek enlightenment. Let Nightlight provide you with equal measure of light, love and laughter, insight, wisdom, and inspiration. Monday nights, 10 to 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Studio B, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. It's Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and we're back with our special guest, Lee Wheelbarger. We were just talking about what's going to occur during the magnetic pole flip when the magnetosphere starts collapsing. And what happens is the shields are down, folks, and that anything coming off the sun is going to affect the Earth in more dangerous ways. Let's put it that way. So what I would expect, and my point of view, moving forward into the grand solar minimum, is that the waning magnetosphere and the pole flip is going to add insult to injury. And as we come out of this minimum in 2021, 22, and we head up into cycle 25, the first major solar flare events are really going to start to affect the grid on the planet. Lee, how do you feel?
Well, a couple things I want to make points of here first.
Please
first,
do.
We will never lose our entire magnetic field. Our magnetosphere will always be here to some extent because we are still an iron planet. We are still inside the orbit and we are still rotating. And the sun is still burning. So as long as the sun is emitting an electromagnetic field and we are an electromagnetic field and those two fields are interacting, there will be something there. And the simple fact that we're spinning, we're creating a magnetic field. So the magnetic field will weaken and the poles will move around, and when they're moving around, we'll have increased amount of particles coming in around wherever those polar regions are, and it'll be some really weird weather, I'm sure. But additionally, we were talking about NASA was saying that they were seeing nuclear explosions out along the bow shock.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen that paper, so I can't speak directly to that paper. But I would disagree with that paper. And the reason that I would disagree with that paper is because after in the electric universe theory, they started the Sapphire Project, I wanted to know more about plasma physics. So I took a plasma physics course from the University of India. So I can tell you all about the plasma in India accent. And so
I bet
I studied it, and so after studying how the bow shock operates and how the particles are coming in and so on and so forth, I would be willing to say that was a plasma event that they are experiencing as opposed to a nuclear explosion.
I agree. But for semantics purposes, let's say they're the same thing, because I don't care what you call it. During a nuclear explosion, you produce the same radionucleotides that you produce in a plasma discharge event. It's the same temperature, the same pressure, and the same exact nucleotides are produced.
I can't say that. Because all of the radioactive material that you would get from a nuclear explosion, be it whatever plutonium, uranium, or what have you, you're going to have a whole lot more of that radioactive material present within the total mass that is projected out from the explosion. Whereas that when a plasma discharge were to take place or to change state from a bright glow to a dim glow or to collapse, where you would get an EMP type event, that would be because the materials that would be ejected would be derived of the soup that was inside the plasma at the time that it collapsed. So
exactly. A man-made nuclear reaction will produce different radionucleotides. This is one in space that's reacting with whatever elements are there.
Correct. But what I'm saying is all of the particles that are present on the Earth are present within that because the sun emits those. And so you're going to get a wide variety of radioactive nuclei, as well as other types of particles and gases and so on and so forth that come off of that, as opposed to if it were just a nuclear warhead or a nuclear explosion, the percentage of radioactive material would be dramatically larger. Is what I'm trying to say, and it's not going to be that way. You're going to get X-rays, you're going to get EMP, you're going to get daylight, infrared, so on and so forth. Whereas that in a nuclear warhead explosion, you won't get those same particles. That's all I'm trying to say.
Well, regardless of which one it is, one thing we can probably agree on is the shock waves involved in whether it's a plasma discharge or a nuclear explosion. And if we're talking about a contracted magnetosphere, so it's essentially happening right in our atmosphere, it could be absolutely devastating on a number of levels.
Well, they're actually already happening, and they're happening here within our atmosphere now. We're already seeing these plasma discharges with the sprites, the blue jets, the gnomes, and so on and so forth. And that's the same thing that's happening out at the bow shock of the magnetosphere. Mm-hmm. It's the exact same. I mean, the very first one that was ever seen, I think, was seen in Vietnam in 1973. The first one that was filmed was in 1983. The first one filmed from space was a year later, and now they're filming them all over the place. They used to be extremely rare, and now there's over 10,000 of them a day. Mm-hmm. They used to be single, and now they're as much as 50 miles wide, and they go, hundreds of miles up and actually touch the ionosphere level, and emit particles out into space, highly charged particles, and it's basically an electrical interchange between the universe and planet Earth. Is basically.
Oh, you talk about Steve.
Yeah.
Steve.
No. Well, yeah. Well, that's actually said. It's a. I can't remember what the abbreviation of it is, but it's a low lying like a Birkeland current, but it's not. It's similar. So they have a new term for what Steve is, but Steve is kind of like a plasma discharge. But what I'm talking about is when the event, because of potential voltage differences between the two layers, be it the ionosphere, the atmosphere, and the ground plane of the Earth itself, there's that interaction when they discharge to try to equalize, and that's where these sprites are coming up. And then now we have what they call a super bolt or positive lightning, which is basically the bottom side of a sprite. And there are thousands of times they've got hundreds of thousands of amps per bolt at literally millions of volts coming down. So that's the interaction that we're having, and we're going to see a lot more of that, because you have to understand that we've got literally thousands of tons of highly charged particles entering our atmosphere each day through our magnetosphere. So, you look at your house outlet has 110 volts in it. The power line going down the street from your house is 35,000 volts. The large power lines that are going across the country are 130, 170,000 volts. Each one of these charged particles coming in are anywhere from 3 tera electron volts to 300 to 500 million tera electron volts. And when they come in, they have that voltage potential. And when they interact with other particles in our atmosphere, they are actually charging them because they're sharing their charge with those other particles. So you have a lot of super highly charged particles floating around up there, and they want somewhere to go. And so when you have an electrical storm come along, and that's part of the rain and the snow and the hail that's moving around inside of that, that's where that voltage comes from, because all of those particles are already previously charged. And that's why when we have these coronal holes in the sun, which used to be pretty rare, to see a coronal hole, just a little black spot on the face of the sun, now they're massive gaping holes that go all the way across the face of the sun, and they're spewing out these particles. And so there are more of those coming in, more highly charged. The storms get bigger because the particles are coming in. They're causing increased nucleation. They have the increased charge on it. You get more lightning out of it. Now we've got more sprites, more gnomes. It's just a cascading cycle that's going to continue to get worse over the next 30 years.
Now, you keep saying 30 years. Do you think after that it's going to get better?
Well, the reason I say 30 years is because when you look at the magnetic field strengths of the sun, because those fields are going 180 degrees out of phase, the sun is going to continue to get worse until both of those fields, or all four of those fields, are 180 degrees out of phase, at which point the sun will be at its weakest. Once that happens in 2030 or 2034 or whatever it is that Valentina Zarkova said that it's going to transpire, another cycle or two from now, when that happens, after we come out of that 180 degrees out of phase, then the sun will start to get powerful again. And as it does, we will start to see sunspots and more sunspots and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that we've got a long way to go until the sun does that. So we have the possibility for substantial snows, substantial glaciation, more ice, freezing, other things going offline, and then getting a whole lot of clouds. And when you look at the output power of the sun over the last 3,000 years, we're on a downward trend. So you've got these spikes that come up and hit that trend line, and then they drop off, and then they come back up and they hit that trend line again. The problem is that even if the sun does come back after we go through this magnetic field change, or 180 degrees out of phase of the sun, when we come back, more than likely we won't come back to what we were just in. So what we experienced in the 80s and the 90s and 2000 and all the way up through 2010, 2012, those are probably the warmest days you'll ever see in your life. The planet is going to continue to cool for, till 2030, 2050. And then we will start warming back up. But when we warm back up, most likely we will only come back to maybe where we are right now or below, if we're lucky.
Now, the cosmic ray forecast is for the cosmic rays to increase through 2150.
Yes.
Wouldn't that cause more cloud nucleation, more albedo, and more cooling, negating any warming effect from the sun?
The only thing that you could hope for is that the sun would come back substantially. And when the sun came back substantially and came into a solar maximum, the solar maximum would drive those cosmic rays. We wouldn't have cosmic rays then, because the sun...
The magnetosphere would be back.
And well, it wouldn't really matter if the magnetosphere was back, because the sun's heliosphere is what really holds the cosmic rays and galactic cosmic rays away. So it traps them in its heliosphere and doesn't allow them to come in anymore. So when the sun is at its highest, as far as its solar maximum, the amount of galactic cosmic rays hitting our planet are, and there's a difference here, and I need to stipulate that. You have cosmic rays which come from our sun, and you have galactic cosmic rays which come from supernovas and other sources within the universe. So the cosmic rays that we're getting right now are spewing out of the coronal holes. If the sun was at solar maximum, we wouldn't have those coronal holes. So the surface of the sun is much stronger, and the magnetic tufts hold it all together, and you don't get the coronal holes. So the cosmic rays disappear. The galactic cosmic rays may be increasing, but once the sun has recovered after this magnetic, going 180 degrees out of phase, or magnetic reversal, whatever you want to put it, once the sun has completed that and it comes back alive and gets bright and has a lot of sunspots on it again, the heliosphere will be much stronger, the solar wind will be stronger, and that energy spewing out of the plasma pinch, which is what the sun is, the energy spewing out laterally will drive all of those cosmic rays, galactic cosmic rays, away or trap them in its heliosphere, so the number of galactic cosmic rays hitting the planet would decrease. So you can't say that just because the number is going to go up, it's going to continue to always go up. It may go up in the area that we are in, but that does not necessarily say that it will go up on our planet. Because the sun can capture part of those. And then once the sun got to its maximum brightness, then the number of galactic cosmic rays coming in on the planet would increase once the sun was at its maximum brightness, and could continue to increase even through that. I'm just saying that with the sun is stronger, we'll see less of them. It's somewhat of a shield to us.
And how do we know that the fields will, the sun's fields will go back into phase in a certain time frame? Is that a regular schedule? Is there?
Yes.
What is that prediction based on? Yeah.
Okay, so there's a solar magnetic observatory in California known as the Wilcox Observatory, and Dr. Valentina Zarkova from Northumbria University took all of the data from Wilcox, and I think they started in 1953 with their recordings. But she took all of those and she created models with it, because her specialty is magnetic fields, and so she was able to predict sunspots and so on and so forth going forward and backwards in and out of the sun's cycles and with 97% accuracy, which is quite remarkable from a model only operating off of 4 magnetic fields. But it shows the regions of magnetic instability and everything in the sun. So it has done it before. So when you look back in time and you say, okay, there is a reversal or a going out of phase of the sun every 206 years. So when you look back at the last time it did this, on the 206-year mark, it's not as bad because only 2 fields are going out of phase. But on the 412 mark, which is where we are now, or they say every 400 years, that is a much worse case scenario. So the last time this happened, George Washington was alive. New York Harbor froze solid. And George Washington, on horseback, with a small contingent of men pulling heavy cannons, went across New York Harbor because it was frozen solid on Christmas Eve, and attacked the British in New York. Now, when was the last time you saw New York Harbor frozen solid?
Never.
So the crazy part about it is this year, New York Harbor started to freeze. At least the waterway that feeds it did. And so originally the Coast Guard went out and they were using small cutters to break the ice, and they're effective up to about 1.5 feet thick of ice on the Hudson River, or anywhere, because that's all the boat's good for. But they were operating on the Hudson River. And by the way, 90% of the fuel oil that goes to the Northeast goes up the Hudson River. So they had to keep it open. Well, the ice got to be greater than 1.5 feet thick. So they had to move up to a tugboat that they had that is capable of breaking through ice up to 3 feet thick. And they were starting to get worried about that because they were encountering ice that was 2.5 feet thick. Now, they've never had to do that in the history of the U.S. Coast Guard and the history of the United States. We have never had icebreakers operating on the Hudson River, to my knowledge or anybody else's that I've been able to find. The problem that we have is Russia is currently building 13 brand new icebreakers, some of them of which are nuclear. The United States, I think, has 3, and one of them is in for a refit. So as we progress into this, we're going to have a lot of waterways that are frozen over, and the U.S. government isn't going to be capable of keeping those waterways open because we don't have the icebreakers to do it. So we've got, in the next 3 years, as we progress into this, we've got some real problems ahead of us as far as infrastructure that's going to collapse, roadways, water pipes, sewage treatment plants, and other, aircraft, aviation, railway, highways are closed. There's going to be a lot of things. Electrical demand on the grid's not going to be able to be supported. So there's going to be a lot of problems as we progress forward into this.
Yes, this is the problem with a global world where every system is dependent on every other system. Things start to break down very quickly when something, quote unquote, breaks.
Let's talk about the timeline, Lee. We just got off of the pole flip. Let's talk about the timeline of the modern eddy minimum. We are now descending into cycle 24. we have probably another year of cycle 24 left until we hit, I'm going to say in 6 months, we should probably 6 to 8 months hit 0 sunspots, and we'll stay there for all of the rest of 2019, and we probably won't see a sunspot until sometime in 2020. What are your thoughts?
I don't even know if we'll see a sunspot in 2020 or 2022, as once the sun's surface gets down below 3,000 gals, the sun isn't even capable of producing a sunspot anymore. So as we continue to go into these magnetic fields opposing each other and the field continues to drop, the sun is going to be even weaker. Now, when you look at the sunspots, a sunspot today is worth a whole lot more than what a sunspot was worth back in the day. Today, a single sunspot counts as 11 to NASA, whereas back in the day, they probably wouldn't even see that sunspot. So what you have to look at is the fact that if they said they saw 5 back in the day, well, that number in today's number could be as much as 15 times higher. Because depending upon the math of how you do it, a sunspot back in the day is worth either 11 today or 15 today, depending upon which era that you schedule that from. So we are already below what they were technically. And when you look at the rate of fall of drop off, and I've done this going back thousands of years looking at beryllium-10 and carbon-14 dating and sunspots that were recorded and the rate of their fall off. I've looked at every solar cycle that's ever been recorded and the sunspots that were recorded in those cycles to try to come up with my models as to how we were falling off so as that I could write my predictions. So what I did was I took all of the descending curves, the depths of the solar minimums, the length of the solar minimums, and the sunspots that were established within those solar minimums during the minimum times. And I established curves for each one of those declines so that I could say, okay, we're steeper than this minimum, we're steeper than that minimum. Well, 18 months ago, we're steeper than anything in recorded history. And so I said, okay, there's a date that we're going to pull out to be equivalent to the Maunder minimum. Well, we missed that 2 months ago. So we're, and when I explain it, like I was talking to a buddy of mine from the World Bank the other day, he's like, well, Leah, how do you explain it? I mean, how do you explain this to people? I said, well, it's real simple. Imagine that you're riding in a car across the desert and all the windows are blacked out and you've got all these sensors in the car, and you know that you're at 0 Gs, you're flying across the desert at like 60 miles an hour, and all of a sudden the ride becomes very smooth, and the G meter starts going towards 0. And you realize that, okay, I went over a jump or something, and I'm going to land. But as the G meter starts going more and more towards 0, you realize the more it's going to hurt when you do land. Well, we've passed 0 and we're still going down. So the predictions that I had, years ago for how cold this was going to be, we're actually there now. And, we're actually moving in on, next year's predictions and the year after's predictions of my predictions from 2 years ago. So we're well ahead of schedule of what I thought we would be seeing. I didn't think that we would be seeing, as much snow as late in the season or as cold as far penetrating south as I saw this year. We are probably 200 miles further south this year in the cold weather than what I thought we would see. And where I was expecting to see temperatures right now being anywhere from 8 to 10 degrees below normal, we're seeing as high as 20 degrees below normal in those same regions. So the progression and really what I attribute this to is the dramatic jump in galactic cosmic rays that we had over the last year or two, creating additional cloud nucleation and cloud refraction and cooling the oceans even more. And so it's really going to come on strong. People will try to forget about it over the summer, but this coming fall and winter, it's going to be devastating to people. And I think we're going to lose even more crops. It's like I predicted that we would lose this winter's wheat crop and have very little of it available. And I think we're down to 13% of it or something is grade A from 20 just about a week ago. So, yeah, it's going to be bad. It's going to be worse. You want anything else on my prediction, or you want to go somewhere else?
Yeah, so based on what you just said, according to what I'm seeing, the next winter will be twice as bad as this winter, meaning that 3-foot ice that might have been forming on Hudson Bay will probably be 6 feet at some point in February. And we're seeing up to 5 feet of snow being predicted for north of Lake Huron on April 16th, Lee. I don't think that's happened in a long time there. It has happened before, maybe in 1960 once, maybe once in 1880. But we're also seeing 32 inches predicted for north central Minnesota for the 15th of April, which would be an all-time record snow there. So the winter isn't even over, and this storm, the GFS models for this weekend are showing a storm that is the second largest winter storm this year, which has seen dozens of winter storms.
Well, we ran out of names. I mean, we were at Wheelberger the other day. You know, so, I mean, is the next one after? I mean, I'm still trying to know what the name of the X, Y, and Z were. So, we got Xena or, Zero, Zeus is the last name. I don't know. And then what do you do after that? Is it Aaron? Aaron as far as the next name. I have to get with the Weather Service to figure out what's going on. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's insane. And I love watching the old time weather forecasters like in New York and Illinois and so on and so forth that are like, is this ever going to end? I've been doing this for 40 years. I never see nothing like this. What's going on here? So, it's ridiculous is what they, and I love, sending little stuff to them. Welcome to the grand solar minimum. You should read John Casey's book, or, you should look at the weather patterns from, the last time we had a little ice age. And, when these weather people start actually looking back in history and realizing that indeed this is a cycle and they will be able to predict the weather much better. And this is why all of the models there for a while were failing quite regularly, because the weather patterns were changing so dramatically. Because it's like Piers Corbin says, the jet stream is migrating further and further south. And the more it does that, if you are below the jet, you're still going to be warmer. But if you're north of the jet in the northern latitude, your average temperature is going to drop anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it's going to really be detrimental to a lot of the northern growing regions that thought that they were going to be able to continue to grow. And this is what I've been discussing with, ag groups and different farmers all over the United States on substantial, lands being planted. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres. So it's going to be a big deal. And, we need to be prepared. I tell everybody they need to have beans, bullets, and Band-Aids, and proper pre-planning prevents piss poor performance. You have got to plan. You have got to have food. You have got to have a fresh water supply. You have to adapt yourselves to what I call a pioneering lifestyle and have things that don't require electronics to operate. So if you're going to have a tractor, make sure it doesn't have a computer on it. I recommend John Deere's built prior to 1988. Vehicles purchased or built prior to 1980. Having a windmill on your well pump to pump the water out of your well and put that into a storage tank so you don't have to have electricity for that. Also have a hand pump attached to that pump so that if the wind isn't blowing, you can still run the hand pump and get water out, because you only live for 3 days without fresh water. So, when it all goes bad, you got to have your beans, your bullets, your Band-Aids, and some water. So make sure your water source your number one priority. And filtration doesn't cut it, because you can't filter water forever, and you still got to find it. So if you have a way to get it out of a source, make sure you take advantage of it.
Proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance, is our saying.
Yes,
Indeed it is.
So my prediction is that Alberta, Saskatchewan will not have a growing season next year. They saw it this year. It's still not above -10, and they're not plowing any fields for months. My friend lives up in central Alberta, and it's like still not above minus 10. It's average minus 20 for 4 months. I can't imagine what you do there. Woo! That's cold. And it's sustained cold. So, Lee, we're headed into the minimum. You and I are diverging here. You think that the minimum could stay in zero sunspots towards 2022, maybe not even a cycle 25 at all emerging. Is that what I'm to hear?
You could have some sunspots into the middle of 25. If
just a few.
Just a few. But, I mean, we're talking small numbers, and I'm talking real sunspots, not the, one little speck comes up and NASA says it's 15. Okay.
Yeah, so then if that's the case, I'm going to say grid failures start in 2022 to 2024. What is your timeline for the way the grand solar minimum affects the empire model? In my book, what's going to happen is starting right now. The growing seasons are shortening. We're going to see a spike in food costs, and quickly the general population savings are going to be extracted simply trying to stay alive and buy food, and that sometime shortly in the future, that's going to lead to shortages in supplies, and then that's when global famines will occur locally, and then the unrest begins. And my timeline is for that to be within 4 years. How do you see it unfolding? What happens first? And how do you think it's going to go down, Lee?
Well, I would say the first thing is, of course, we're going to see a lot of the growing areas going offline, and that's going to dramatically increase the commodity prices and, like you said, cause food shortages. I mean, there are already countries that are having food shortages right now. This past year, we had the lowest grape harvest since World War II. And that's because they were all blown away from the bombing in World War II. But this year they were all frozen and, had a bad year. And lots of people are having that. So we're going to continue to see that. Like you said, it'll be really bad in about 3 years is when we're probably going to start to really see a majority of these growing areas going offline and massive amounts of crop failures. So it'll be quite obvious by then. The unrest will start prior to that. I believe that we will start seeing more unrest in the next 2 years, and we've already seen some of that. That's why Putin went in and took Crimea, and that's why the Chinese have done what they've done in South Africa, and they've changed laws in South Africa for the Chinese. So as these major countries like China and Russia, they're going to take advantage of the third world countries as much as possible. And so they will, invade those and conquer those and take their food stores. And I think that'll be happening in less than 3 years, or right about 3 years. As far as major conquests, I think Russia is going to be the tiger or bear of the planet. They're going to be the polar bear rather than the Russian bear, because they have developed so many military technologies to be able to deal with cold weather, amphibious operations, snow, as well as CME and EMP type events. So I think Russia is going to be the big winner, around as far as in Europe, because Russia has Russia has spent $500 million on greenhouses. Russia is putting greenhouses in Siberia. Russia is putting nuclear reactors onto barges to be able to float them up the rivers. Their policy is, if the river is frozen, we take heaters and melt the ice and go up the river. I mean, that's how the Russians do. They don't care. They just, it's like I used to have a guy that was Russian that worked for me when we were building some military things, and he would just weld stuff together. He didn't care the shape of it or whatever. And I was like, Yuri, can't you make that thing, just look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing? And he goes, Lee, it don't have to be pretty. It's just got to work. And I was like, well, okay. And so that is the Russians' way of doing it. So they believe in brute force. And so that's what they're doing. And so when it comes to military conflicts in the future, Russia has several aces up their sleeve. And I think all the rest of the deck is marked. So, Russia will be the number one you will have to look out for. I think China will be behind that. I think China is more worried about keeping their factories busy and feeding their people through this than conquest. I think that China is militarizing and increasing their military. They want their presence in the South China Sea so as that if they want to invade down into any of those island areas down there or in the South Asia area, that they would be able to do so with impunity and use their agricultural resources to feed the billions of China. I don't see China coming to the United States. I surely see Russia. But that is going to be years out. That would be after we have other major problems and economic issues and infrastructure issues. If I were Putin, that's when I would come into the United States just simply by driving across the Bering Sea, or coming up across that, because Canada's not going to do anything to stop Russia.
No, they'll pave the road. Leah, do you have any?
Well, I was just thinking, too, that I'm not quite sure about China, but I think Russia may also have an advantage in terms of food growing. Here in the United States, we have a very centralized system, which in many respects is dependent on large corporations such as Monsanto, for example. Russia, not quite so much, more in favor of local organic gardening and such things. And I think that's going to be a huge benefit because it's going to, you have a bunch of people that are used to providing food for themselves anyway. In this country, not at all the case. Everybody wants to go to the grocery store, and that's just how it is. It's just not a regular practice here to grow your own food. And if conditions worsen, you need to be able to adapt to your local climate. And so there might be an advantage there.
We haven't even started over here in the United States. Lee, what was the number you just said? How much money on greenhouses in Russia?
$5 billion.
$5 billion in greenhouses in Russia. And if you look, so I have a connection in central China who's been studying the agriculture in that region for a decade. They literally have hundreds of thousands of greenhouses. Every single small town, which is 40 million people, grows 80% of all of its fresh food within 300 feet of the people. Each single section of blocks has its own greenhouse, and all the food is out in the local market. What we're going to actually bring some of this technology here to Colorado and use it because it is just producing so much food in harsh climates. You can have temperature swings, you can be in high alpine environments, and you can extend your growing season for months. We're going to have the same growing season as like Georgia here in the high alpine region. And these are massive greenhouse structures that are affordable, definitely the way of the future. These countries know. Many of these countries with the largest populations and the largest land masses are already prepared. And I think that by design, the United States is not.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we used to have civil defense drills. Everybody knew where the shelter was. Russia's doing that right now. Russia put every single one of their citizens underground in a matter of a couple hours. There's only a couple countries, Switzerland and Sweden and a couple other countries in the world that can be able to even do anything like that their population is still prepared and knows what to do. Russia has food under the ground. They have generators. They have fuel. They're practicing for all of this for a cosmic calamity. And one of the things that we didn't touch on when I was talking about these magnetic fields in the sun going 180 degrees out of phase is when that happens, you have these little whirlpools on the surface of magnetic fields, and those are regions of what is referred to as magnetic instability. And so I think it was sunspot 2671 or 2 or 3 or whatever it was that had that huge CME that ejected off the back side of the sun. Those things happen about every 200 years because they come along with this. Because everybody talks about the Carrington event of 1859, and that's because we had newspapers and teletypes and wires strung all over the place and fires and people got zapped and paper clips caught things on fire and trash cans. That was talked about then. But there was also another event in 1640 of the same type thing where the entire sky glowed at night, from another of these events. But that particular event that we saw on that day made the Carrington event look like a firecracker compared to a nuclear warhead, because the event that ejected off the backside of the sun that day created a tsunami shock wave that went all the way around the sun and created a tsunami going across the face of the sun that was visible from just, you know, a ground-based telescope in your backyard, or even you could probably, if you had really good eyes and a good welder's shield, you could have seen it go across. I mean, I was absolutely staggered by
it. Also fried the surface of Mars and lit up the furthest electric comet ever observed, Comet Pan-STARRS, out past the orbit of Uranus. That flare, had it been Earth-facing, would have sent us into the Stone Age instantly.
Absolutely. And that is what people need to be prepared for, because during this is when you have these more commonly going into it and coming out of it. So you never know when it's going to come. It can happen anytime. There doesn't really need to be a sunspot there at the time it comes. It can develop and whap, there it is. You know, and that's the way it was on the Carrington event. There was a sunspot, and then boom, boom. You know, and there was actually during the Carrington event, there were flares from, I think, August the 30th all the way through like the 3rd of September. So there were, I think, 5 total flares during that. Just one of them was really, really bad. And so I think it was a combination of all of them together coming through. But the flare or CME that happened on 2673 or whatever the number was, that was so much larger than the Carrington event that, you know, we would have been wiped out permanently, basically, as far as the electrical grid in this country and other countries, because events like that transpire over hours, but it only takes minutes to take a grid down, because the grid, as far as the electric lines, when the electromagnetic storm induces the energy into the grid, it only takes 2 volts per kilometer to take the grid down, but those storms are easily capable of inducing as many as 10 volts per kilometer on the grid. And it just fries the transformers, the generators, and so on and so forth, because there's a DC current flowing on top of the AC current over the grid, and the grid won't handle that, and it goes down. That was demonstrated during the Halloween storm. So there's a lot of different things that we can still experience without having a Carrington type event of that magnitude, and still lose a lot of grid or communications, GPS, and satellites. So there's other things to worry about just in the cold too.
It brings up another potential concern. You know, some of the large flares that we've seen, such as the one that came out of 2673. You know, they're typically on the backside of the sun. I have the distinct impression that this is largely due to the Earth-facing quiet phenomena, and I'm wondering if it's perhaps not the case when our magnetosphere is so weak that those tend to happen on the backside of the sun. What do you think of that?
I think we think much alike.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have a theory on the Earth-facing quiet.
I'd love to hear that.
Okay, so my theory on the Earth-facing quiet is you look at our magnetosphere, and if you imagine an orange that you've peeled the skin off of, you can see the slices of the orange and those white lines coming down after you've taken the skin off. That's how our magnetosphere magnetic lines are around the Earth, okay? So the sun has lines like that somewhat too. So if we are close to the sun, we are somewhat pulling on those magnetic fields. And so if we are somewhat spreading them apart on the far side of the sun and somewhat bunching them together on our side of the sun, that provides a somewhat slightly stronger magnetic field on our side, which would subdue those somewhat. Whereas that once they get away from the Earth-facing quiet, those bands are opening up a little bit more on the other side and allows them to to go ahead and eject out into space in a CME, because the field lines that we're trying to contain all of that plasma aren't nearly as bunched up as much, if you kind of see what I'm saying.
Yep.
So, that's my theory on it. I haven't had anybody do anything with it yet, but that's, I'd like to see how that model lays out as far as how those two magnetic, because I mean, they are two magnetic fields that are interacting. And so there has to be some attraction to that, to do that. And, we're a decent sized planet and we're fairly close in. And, when you look at it, it always seems that Earth facing quiet, has that appeal that, everybody that looks for the aurora hopes that the one coming around from stereo A is, going to light up the night sky for them. But when it comes around on this side, it's another dud.
Well, a paper did come out a month ago discussing something called magnetic cages.
Yes.
And so when these spots come around and face Earth, they get trapped in magnetic field cages. And even if they do flare, the flare itself doesn't escape the cage, so it doesn't even come Earth facing. It'll recollapse back to the surface.
Yes. And I haven't seen that paper, but that goes right along with what my hypothesis on it has been for quite some time. And then the other thing that I still have yet to have a good astrophysicist, answer this question for me, is that when we do have these coronal hole streams and they're going by and the particles are coming out, if we do have a CME release of like a large magnetic filament, I'm wanting to know if and I believe it is true, that magnetic filament will actually collect other particles that were around it that were spewing out and whip it, kind of like a wet towel, you know what I'm saying? And whip those particles out and actually increase the size of the storm that we get, because it has increased the velocity of those particles. And so there's been a couple storms that I've seen where we had coronal holes and we had a filament release, and the filament didn't look that big, but because there was a coronal hole there, it looked like the effects of that were larger than they should have been. And I'm also accounting for the fact that the magnetosphere is weaker, and so now the smaller storms are having a much greater effect on the planet. I mean, we're getting auroras on nights that, you would have never thought that the KP indices would have came off the floor.
Right, and this is after the mainstream is publishing garbage for a year that we're never going to see aurora again. I'm like, it's the exact opposite. When we get to KP2, it lights up in Minnesota. Yeah. But what you just said, Lee, is exactly true, and I'm going to verify it. So I've been looking for the mechanism of that, and it is the filament eruption. So what started happening about 8 months ago is these coronal holes either produced massive geomagnetic storms, or they really didn't affect us at all, and they were the same type of hole. One had a major geo-effective effect, the other one didn't do anything. And it was the coronal holes turning that coincided with filament eruptions, because back a few months ago, we had a filament eruption like every week for almost 2 months. And it was the coronal hole streams that were coupled with a filament eruption that were causing the geomagnetic storms. Boom.
Yep.
Totally agree with you there. Now, I want to talk about this amazing fact. I think that next year will be the first year that the glaciers begin to build in many places, northern and southern latitudes on the globe, specifically Glacier National Park, where all the alarmists are saying glaciers have been melting. They have been since the end of the Dalton minimum, but they're going to now start forming as we drop off into the Eddy minimum. One of the reasons I'm saying that is because Arctic sea ice volume, starting in the first week of March to right now, has increased at epic amounts, jumping from the 2017 levels and today touching, and by tomorrow surpassing the 2015 volume, and we're headed towards 2014, and by mid-May we are going to be above the multi-decadal average of Arctic ice, which hasn't been seen since a while ago.
And I agree with you. And actually, Glacier National Park has a kind of special place in my heart. I used to hang out in Dixon and have friends that live in Dixon, Montana, which is right down the road. And I actually fought fire at the Glacier Fire for the National Park Service there. But this year, they have actually had more snow in Glacier and have broken some records there. And I think they're at an all-time record or on the verge of breaking their all-time record there right now. I think that was reported about 2 weeks ago. So with this storm that's coming through now and anything that comes behind it, I think that their all-time records are going to be broken. So I think that glaciation is actually in its infancy or inception stage right now. And we do have glaciers that are already growing. I think we're up to like 37 or 40 some that are already growing right now this year.
The Hudson Bay ice thickness is at record levels, especially in the northern portion. But for the majority of Hudson Bay, we're seeing in the entire northern region that it's over 2.5 meters currently in April. That's not going to melt off until sometime in August. So there's a point in which there is a floating piece of ice in Hudson Bay that is still there in October, and then it gets game on, because Hudson Bay will freeze over, and then that's the beginning of the Canadian Shield freezing over into an entire ice sheet.
Right, and we will see that. We're starting to see, more and more ice sheets growing in places that they weren't before. I mean, the Northwest Passage is closed, and people were talking about trying to use that for shipping. I mean, I got a kick out of all the global warming people that went up there and got their boats caught in the ice. So, I thought that was, a hoot. And then the thing that really shocked me about this winter is I think it's the largest or the second largest icebreaker ever produced. It's a great big behemoth thing that the Russians produced. It was produced, I think it was built or commissioned or set to sea in 1983. And since 1983, it's only been stuck once in history, and it got itself out. This winter, it is frozen in solid with no chance of rescue. And that is just absolutely unheard of, because they didn't think they were going to have any problem going through where they were going through at all. And you have to really wonder when, you've got the captain of this boat that's been on there for decades and has seen everything there is to see, and there's ice, and he gets caught up in something that he never even expected. What are you going to do when all the icebreakers are froze up? Where are you going to, how are you going to keep their routes open then? Because when one of the biggest in the world is now frozen in a block of ice, what else do you bring? You see what I'm saying? I mean, this is going to cut off regions of the planet that, are used to large amounts of ship traffic, and they're going to have to come up with other ports and other avenues to try to get those supplies in and out to those people. And with the what's so-called just-in-time delivery system, it ain't going to work.
Mm-hmm. So, come on, Lee. I saw ice road truckers.
Yeah.
Didn't we also just have a few Navy subs get stuck in ice recently in the last couple of weeks? I mean, that was hilarious as well.
Right.
One U.S. sub and one Russian sub, and there were actually photographs of extremely healthy-looking, fully mature polar bears walking right up to eat those servicemen.
And I could have swore that Al Gore said that they were going to be homeless by 2014.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. There's no more snow, no more ice, kids. It's just at record levels and falling all over the globe at unprecedented levels. The entire state of Montana, every single city is about to break the all-time snow record for the entire state, back to 1886. It is going to happen, and next year we're going to see more mind-blowing things. We only have a few minutes left, Lee. Do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners? Maybe some hints on how to survive and thrive in the coming times, places they can start? And if I could, can we have you on next week where we can talk about like maybe some solutions like Faraday cages and EMP protection and stuff like that?
Sure. I've really enjoyed myself, so I'd be happy to come back and profess whatever I can to help people. That's my goal is to teach as many people as many things as I can, so as that they are better prepared for what's coming. Now, if you want your daily dose of Lee Wheelbarger, I'm Lee Lee Wheelbarger, WHEELBARGER on Twitter. And so each day I tweet things in regards to the grand solar minimum, things for preparing, things you need to look out for. So it's Lee's daily dose of reality. So if you want to follow what I'm doing, that's how you can do that. As far as people, what they need to do to prepare, other than follow my Twitter feed and look at the different things that I recommend to purchase and so on and so forth. But you need to look at what people had back in the 1880s and the 1890s and prior to electricity. So, think about, heirloom seeds for growing in your garden. Think about greenhouses. Put mushrooms in the north side of your greenhouse so you increase your CO2. Get LED lighting, infrared lighting. You can pick it up at Walmart very cheaply, 12-volt lighting. Buy books. My God, buy all the books you can get and learn the pioneering lifestyles. Learn when to grow, what to put in the garden, start a garden. Be prepared with food stores, dried beans, rice, bullets, Band-Aids, water supply. Don't count on the grid, and don't count on some guy from the government coming up and knocking on your door and saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. That's never going to happen, because
he may come to take 50% of your shit,
but he's lying to you.
Right. And the way you can tell he's lying is his lips are moving. So the thing that you have to be prepared and able to take care of yourself, and you have to be able to do that for an extended period of time. So, I tell everybody you need 5 years worth of grain as far as to plant, seeds to put in your garden and so on and so forth. And you need a minimum of a year's supply of every kind of food that you can eat. And I'm talking a healthy supply. Don't look at rationing things. And so, freeze-dried foods or beans or whatever else, rice. I mean, we have, lots of stuff here, but, you put rice in containers. You can go and get nitrogen gas. You put the nitrogen into the large trash can that the bags of rice or beans or whatever are in. You fill that trash can up with the nitrogen gas, so there is no oxygen in there whatsoever, because nitrogen is heavier than air. And you just put a little stream of it in there. It fills it up, and the way you can tell when it's full is you hold a lighter down in there. When the lighter goes out, the air is gone. Then you put the lid back on and you tape it and you leave it right there where it sets, and that'll be good for 1,000 years. Because there's no oxygen in there. So, that's how you can, Redneck way to prepare. Redneck Faraday cage, use a galvanized trash can with aluminum backed tape around the lip of it. Put the electronic items that you want to protect inside of it so as that there is no electrical connection between them and the side of the container. So you wrap them up in bubble plastic, keep them in their original boxes from the store. It doesn't matter. Put them inside, put the lid on it, put 2 wraps of that, 2-inch, 3-inch wide, 4-inch wide, whatever it is, duct tape that has the aluminum foil on it around the lip, and everything inside that container is safe. Now, my only recommendation to you in that is, if something does happen and all the power goes out and everything gets fried, don't go run open that container, because CMEs and EMPs and things of that nature that come off of the sun normally comes in 2s or 3s, and sometimes as many as 4 or 5. So you need to at least let 5 or 6 days pass before you open that trash can. Or if you have to have something, take it out of the trash can immediately and put it back in, because there may be another one coming and you have no way of knowing it's coming. So, those are my quick down and dirty 12-volt alternator. Hook it to a 10-speed bicycle in 10th gear. You need a minimum of a 27-inch wheel on the bicycle. Use the emergency replacement belts that you can get from Harbor Freight to go to the alternator. Have it be a 12-volt battery hooked to it, and then have 12-volt appliances, 12-volt lighting in your house. Little walkie-talkies and things of that nature that you can plug into a cigarette lighter charger. Pedal the bicycle. Keep your cooler for $59 from Walmart, so you can have cool food or make ice or what have you. The the average person can put out 750 watts, and a refrigerator uses less than that a day. So it's pretty easy to have a little refrigerator and a nice inverter. Inverters, I recommend only Outback. And the reason I recommend only Outback is they are the only ones that have passed mil-spec 42.2B or whatever. 1846.2B is the only one that has ever passed the generator mil-spec. It's the only inverter in history that's done that. So I use exclusively Outback inverters on all of my projects for the military, civilian, and commercial. And I use their M version, which is their mobile version, and they also have a marine version, which is totally waterproof, which is great for, if you've got a mobile application. Same thing for solar charger controllers. I mean, I can go on like this all night, guys. I've been doing this for 35 years.
Well, how about we have you back next Wednesday, and you can extrapolate and expound on those very topics. So next week we're going to have Lee Wheelbarger back on the show, where we're going to discuss proper prior planning to prevent piss-poor performance in the coming Eddie minimum. And I want to thank Lee for coming on. It's been an awesome conversation. I want to thank Leah, who's 8 feet from me over in the trailer, for joining me on this phone call. And, guys, I want to thank you, the listener. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have a radio program to do. We're going to be showing this on our YouTube channel in just a few days, and let Freedom Slips Revolution Radio get a chance to get some of new subscribers to their archive list. So if you haven't made a donation to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, do it now. Give them $5.